The November rain came down in sheets, tapping its restless rhythm against the wide front windows of Bella Vista. Each drop caught the glow of the Edison bulbs strung across the ceiling, as if the storm itself were leaning close to watch the life inside. The restaurant had been Marco Romano's dream, though not the kind he once envisioned. Instead of gleaming towers in the city center and white-jacketed brigades at his command, he had poured his heart into this small neighborhood place with mismatched wooden tables, and the scent of rosemary baked into its walls. At 36, he had chosen something rarer than prestige, a life built around his daughter, Isabella. That evening the restaurant was hushed, as Marco liked it on weeknights. A single couple lingered over wine near the back, their murmurs blending with the rain, and Isabella sat at her favorite corner table, coloring furiously with a crayon in each hand. Her curls, golden and untamable, tumbled over her forehead, lit up by the honey glow from the lamps. Marco kept one eye on her as he chopped fennel in the kitchen, smiling to himself at the small furrow of concentration she wore. "Papa," Isabella announced suddenly, raising her head from her drawing of what might have been an elephant or a cloud in boots. "I'm hungry." Marco wiped his hands on his apron and stepped out to her. "What would my little chef like tonight?" His voice softened automatically, the way it always did with her. "The soup that tastes like hugs," she said, her tone solemn, as though issuing a royal decree. He laughed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Of course, Piccola. But first, let Papa finish his prep for tomorrow." Isabella nodded, already returning to her purple elephant, and Marco slipped back into the kitchen. The rain seemed to grow louder, a steady drumbeat against the glass. When the chime of the front door cut through it, Marco glanced up. A woman entered, her presence sharp against the cozy warmth of Bella Vista. She wore a navy suit that had clearly cost more than Marco's monthly food order, though it clung awkwardly now, damp at the shoulders. Her blonde hair, twisted into a bun with precise efficiency, had come undone in rebellious wisps plastered by the rain. She balanced a briefcase in one hand, an umbrella dripping onto the floor, and in the other she struggled with a baby carrier from which spilled a wail, so piercing it turned every head. Marco stepped out from behind the counter before he even thought about it. The woman's eyes, tired and rimmed red, swept across the empty tables. "Excuse me," she said, her voice breaking on the word. "Are you still open?" The clock above the bar showed it was well past closing, but the desperation in her tone silenced any instinct to refuse. "Of course," Marco said simply, gesturing to the tables. "Please, sit wherever you like." She lowered the carrier carefully near the kitchen, setting the briefcase down with a thud that sounded more like surrender than routine. The baby, a girl, Marco guessed, 6 months at most, squirmed violently, her cries as insistent as the storm outside. The woman pressed trembling hands against her temples, closing her eyes for one long, ragged breath. She looked nothing like the titans of industry Marco sometimes glimpsed in magazines. Yet there was something about her posture, even in exhaustion, that suggested she was used to commanding rooms larger than this. "I'm sorry," she whispered when Marco approached with a menu. "She's been crying for 3 hours. I've tried everything, feeding, rocking, nothing works. She won't take the bottle," and her composure cracked. "The nanny quit this morning." Marco glanced down at the baby, her face flushed crimson with frustration, her tiny fist beating the air. His chest tightened in recognition. He remembered nights when Isabella's cries had seemed endless, when the world shrank to the rhythm of her unhappiness. He looked back at the woman, her eyes glassy with exhaustion, and spoke gently. "May I?" He nodded toward the baby carrier. She froze, the instinctive hesitation of a mother guarding her child flashing across her features. But after a beat, her shoulders sagged. She nodded, surrendering her daughter into the hands of a stranger. Marco bent low, his hands practiced, tender as he lifted the infant. Her cries pitched higher at first, but he whispered something in Italian, soft and lilting, and the sound seemed to slow her sobs. Isabella watched from the corner, her crayon poised in midair, wide eyes tracking the new arrival in her father's arms. For a moment, the restaurant itself seemed to still, the rain tapping, the Edison bulbs humming, the air fragrant with butternut, squash, and cinnamon. Marco swayed gently, the baby pressed against his chest, his voice a low rumble of comfort. And in that fragile space, Catherine Blackwell, the woman who had built an empire, who could negotiate any deal and command any boardroom, sat silently, her breath shuddering, watching a stranger calm her child with nothing more than warmth and patience. A tear slid down her cheek, surprising her. She quickly brushed it away, but the taste of salt lingered on her lips. For the first time in a very long while, Catherine Blackwell felt something she could not control. Asterisk, the baby's cries filled every corner of Bella Vista, rising and falling like waves breaking against stone. Even the couple at the back gathered their coats and left quietly, leaving only the storm outside and the storm within. Marco felt the small body shuddering against his chest, her lungs desperate with protest. He had rocked Isabella through nights like this, when it seemed no comfort could reach her. He knew the truth sometimes. Babies cried not only for hunger or discomfort, but because the world itself was too much to bear. Still, he noticed something else, the infant's jaw rooting against the fabric of his shirt, the frantic turn of her head, hunger, the kind that built into panic if ignored long. Marco's chest tightened. "I told you," the woman murmured, her hands gripping the table edge until her knuckles widened. "She's starving. She won't drink. She won't take the bottle. I don't know what else to." Her voice cracked in the middle, fraying at the edges like paper torn to thin. Marco studied her quietly. There was power in her posture still, a coiled precision, but her face betrayed the cost of carrying it alone. "She needs something gentle," he said softly. "Not formula tonight. Real food, something her senses don't fight against." The woman blinked, confusion warring with doubt. "She's only 6 months. Are you saying?" "Puree," Marco said simply. "I'll make her something warm, easy, natural. Let me try." A silence stretched. Outside, the rain hammered harder, thunder rumbling low in the distance. Catherine, though Marco didn't yet know her name, leaned back in the chair, looking at him as if deciding whether to hand over not just her child, but a part of herself. She never surrendered. Finally, she exhaled. "Do it." Marco carried the baby into the kitchen with him, humming softly under his breath. Isabella hopped down from her chair, trailing after, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "Papa, is she going to be okay?" she whispered, peeking at the baby. "Yes, Piccola," Marco assured her. "She just needs food that loves her back." He said. He'd overheard the name muttered under the woman's breath into a small basket seat near the counter. Her cries slowed, curiosity flickering in her tear-bright eyes as she watched him move. Marco pulled down a butternut squash from the shelf, sliced it cleanly in half, and scraped the seeds with practiced speed. He worked quickly, but with reverence, as if each motion carried more weight than simple cooking. Cinnamon, vanilla, a drizzle of olive oil. The kitchen filled with sweetness and warmth, the storm's fury dulled by the promise of comfort rising from the pan. Asterisk, Catherine sat rigid at the table, her briefcase at her feet, her phone buzzing with messages she dared not read. She should have been at a board meeting in the city, holding court with men twice her age who both feared and resented her authority. Instead, she sat in a tiny restaurant that smelled of cinnamon and rain, watching a stranger cook for her child. When Marco returned, he carried a small porcelain dish, steam curling upward. He sat across from Catherine, spoon in hand, and dipped it into the puree, blowing gently until it cooled. He held it near Emma's lips, murmuring in that low Italian cadence. The baby hesitated, turned her head once, then opened her mouth just a little. Marco coaxed, gentle as tidewater. The first spoonful went in, and silence fell. Emma swallowed, eyes blinking wide as though she'd discovered something new about the world. Another spoonful, another swallow. Then, as if she had decided the fight was over, her cries melted into soft, hiccuping breaths. Catherine pressed her hands to her mouth, her shoulders trembling. For hours she had tried to force calm into her daughter, only to watch it shatter again and again. And here, this man, this chef, with his flour-dusted apron and tired eyes, had done in minutes what she could not. "Dio mio," Marco murmured, smiling faintly as Emma reached toward the spoon. "She likes it, she." Catherine tried to speak, but her throat closed around the words. Tears, hot and unbidden, blurred her vision. She turned her face, ashamed of the weakness clawing its way through her armor. She was Catherine Blackwell, woman of steel, empire builder, strategist of Fortune 500 titans. And yet in this moment, she was only a mother who could not feed her child. Asterisk, "Don't," Marco said gently, catching the motion. "Don't hide. It's only love when it breaks us like this." The words pierced deeper than he knew. Catherine lowered her hands, staring at him through her tears. For the first time in years, she felt herself stripped bare, without title, without armor, just a woman in the rain, watching another human being teach her daughter how to be soothed. The storm outside roared louder, wind rattling the glass as if it too wanted it. Suspense curled around the edges of the little restaurant to lives, colliding unexpectedly. Their walls cracking under the weight of a single crying child now fed and finally, blessedly, at peace. The storm showed no sign of mercy. Sheets of rain lashed the windows, turning the glass into rivers of silver. Inside Bella Vista, warmth wrapped around the little trio like a secret. Emma had finished her small dish of puree, her cries replaced by soft, sleepy coos. Marco had set her carrier near the kitchen door, where he could keep watch. But Catherine's eyes clung to her daughter as if she were a fragile miracle that might vanish the moment she looked away. She sat upright, arms folded across her chest, as though trying to stitch her composure back together. The mask of Catherine Blackwell, CEO, strategist, untouchable force, was quick to return, but her hands trembled faintly on the tabletop. Marco noticed, though he said nothing. It was Isabella who broke the silence. She had crept closer, her crayons clutched in her little hands. She slid a piece of paper across the table with all the solemnity of an offering. On it was a crooked drawing of 3 figures, a tall man with spiky hair, a little girl with golden curls, and beside them, another woman drawn in blue crayon. Catherine blinked. "Is that me?" she asked, surprised by the sudden lump in her throat. Isabella nodded vigorously. "You look like a princess when you came in. A tired princess. But you're smiling now, see?" She pointed at the woman's lopsided crayon smile. The words struck deeper than Catherine expected. A tired princess. She almost laughed, almost corrected the child, but instead something twisted inside her chest. A pressure she hadn't let herself feel in years. She reached out, hesitated, then touched the edge of the paper with her fingertips. Marco watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. He had seen Isabella's gift before, her uncanny ability to cut through to the heart of a person, without meaning to. Tonight, it seemed, was no different. Catherine cleared her throat, pushing the paper back gently. "That's very kind of you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "But I'm not much of a princess. More like a dragon." Isabella giggled, unafraid. "Then maybe you need soup too. Papa makes soup that tastes like hugs." Catherine froze. The child's innocence was disarming, peeling away her practiced defenses faster than any boardroom battle ever had. She glanced toward Marco, who had leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching her with an unreadable expression. For the first time that night, Catherine felt exposed. Her phone buzzed again, a sharp vibration against the wood of the table. She snatched it up reflexively, glancing at the screen. 7 missed calls. 3 texts marked urgent. The name of her company blinked at her like an accusation. She almost stood, almost gathered her things, ready to bolt back into the world that demanded her every breath. But then Emma stirred, a small, contented sigh escaping her lips as she drifted deeper into sleep. Catherine froze. Her body was torn into directions, the empire that could collapse without her, and the baby that had finally found rest in this strange man's restaurant. Marco broke the silence. "If you leave now," he said, his tone calm but firm, "she'll wake again. Babies know. They feel what we carry." Catherine's eyes snapped to him. "Excuse me." He didn't flinch. "She feels your storm before she feels her own hunger. That's why she wouldn't eat." The words hit like a blow. Catherine had been called ruthless, brilliant, cold but never transparent. This man, with his flower on his sleeves and his quiet certainty, was peeling away truths she had buried so deep even she had stopped looking at them. She swallowed hard, forcing steel back into her voice. "You don't know me." Marco shrugged lightly. "No, but I know children. And I know what it is to carry too much." He nodded toward Isabella, who was busy adjusting her crayons into a perfect line. "She saved me when I didn't know how to breathe anymore. Maybe Emma will do the same for you." Suspense hung thick in the air. Catherine wanted to fire back, to reclaim the ground she always held in arguments. Yet the weight of his words lingered. She thought of the nights in her penthouse, the endless conference calls, the lonely silence when the nanny carried Emma away so she could close another deal. And she realized, with a sharp pang, she couldn't remember the last time her daughter had rested this peacefully. Isabella climbed into her father's lap and looked at Catherine with those unfiltered child's eyes. "Do you not smile at your baby?" she asked, innocent and devastating in equal measure. Catherine's breath caught. Her throat burned. For one terrifying second, she felt as though this child had cracked her wide open and seen all the guilt she had been burying. She wanted to stand, to flee, to gather Emma and run back to her fortress of glass and steel. But her legs would not move. The storm outside howled, rattling the windows like a warning. Inside Bella Vista, Catherine Blackwell, billionaire and titan, sat frozen in a stranger's restaurant, undone not by rivals or markets or collapsing contracts, but by the simple question of a 4-year-old girl, and for the first time in 15 years. She did not know how to answer. The rain had turned to a relentless roar, hammering the roof and streaking down the windows in angry rivers. Bella Vista's Edison bulbs flickered slightly, their warm glow fighting against the storm. The restaurant felt like an island adrift at sea. Cut off from the world, Catherine knew boardrooms, towers of glass, endless meetings filled with voices that never paused. Emma slept soundly in her carrier, the faint rise and fall of her chest the only proof of her fragile surrender. Catherine kept glancing at her daughter, as though afraid that at any moment she would dissolve into wailing again. But the silence held, deep and strange, and Catherine found herself unable to sit still. Marco noticed. He had the kind of gaze that seemed to see what people tried to hide, and Catherine hated it. She rose from the table abruptly, pacing to the window, her reflection fractured in the glass by rivulets of water. She looked like the women layered on top of each other, the flawless CEO with her sharp suit and top bun, and the exhausted mother with shadows under her eyes and hands that trembled. When she thought no one was watching, "You look like you're about to break," Marco said from behind her. His voice was low, steady, carrying none of the judgment she expected. She spun toward him. "You think I'm weak?" The words came sharper than she intended, too sharp for this quiet room. He shook his head slowly. "No, I think you're tired of being stronger than you need to be." Something twisted in her chest, a mixture of anger and recognition. She wanted to snap back, to reassert the walls she always carried with her, but before she could, Isabella interrupted. "Papa," she chirped, tugging at his sleeve, "can the princess help you cook?" Catherine blinked, startled. "What?" Marco smiled faintly. "My little chef has decided you need to earn your dinner." He gestured toward the kitchen. "Come, I'll show you something." Catherine almost refused. The very idea seemed absurd her, in a kitchen, chopping vegetables like some domestic fantasy. But Isabella's expectant eyes were piercing to hopeful, and before she knew it, Catherine found herself walking into the heart of Bella Vista. The kitchen was alive with scent and warmth. Steam curled from a pot of broth, the earthy sweetness of squash and carrots hanging heavy in the air. Copper pans glowed under the lights, and every surface bore the marks of Marco's devotion scars on cutting boards. Flour dust in the corners, jars of spices labeled in his handwriting. "Here," Marco said, handing her a knife. Catherine recoiled slightly. "I don't exactly," he interrupted. "You don't, but you will." His tone left no room for argument. He set a carrot on the board in front of her. Slice. Her hands, trained for pens and contracts, felt clumsy around the knife. She hesitated, then pressed down. The cut was uneven, jagged. She winced, ready for criticism, but Marco only said, "Again." She cut another. Still uneven, but less so. Then another. Slowly, a rhythm emerged, though sweat prickled her neck from the intensity of her focus. She had faced hostile takeovers, billion-dollar negotiations, the collapse of markets, but never had she felt so absurdly challenged as she did by a row of carrots. Under the steady gaze of this man, "What's the point of this?" she demanded finally, dropping the knife with a sigh. Marco picked up one of her uneven slices, held it up to the light. "The point is you can't control everything. Not the shape, not the storm outside, not your daughter's cries." He set it into the simmering broth. "But you can still make something beautiful out of what isn't perfect." Catherine felt her throat tighten. She wanted to scoff, to dismiss it as sentimental nonsense, but the scent of the broth rose up, rich and comforting, and the truth of his words slipped under her defenses. Her hand drifted unconsciously to the silver locket around her neck. Marco's eyes followed the movement. "You wear it like a shield," he said quietly. Her fingers froze on the chain. "It's none of your business. Maybe," he said, turning back to the stove. "But sometimes the things we hide behind weigh more than the things we're hiding." Catherine's heart stumbled. The locket had not been opened in years. Inside lay a photograph she couldn't bear to look at. The face of a woman who had once embodied everything Catherine was too busy to hold onto. She pressed the chain tighter against her chest, as if the pressure could silence the ache. Marco ladled soup into a bowl and set it in front of her. "Taste." She lifted the spoon, her hand trembling slightly, and brought it to her lips. The flavor hit her instantly, velvet warmth, a sweetness tempered with spice. and with it came a memory so sharp she nearly dropped the spoon. Her mother's voice, humming softly in their small kitchen. The smell of cinnamon. A hand brushing her hair back as she leaned over a bowl that tasted like home. Tears sprang to Catherine's eyes before she could stop them. She turned away, but Marco's voice followed her. "It's not weakness to remember," he said. "It's what keeps us human." The storm thundered above, rattling the restaurant as if to echo the chaos inside her. Catherine gripped the edge of the counter, fighting to hold herself together. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure she could dot and outside the kitchen door. Isabella peeked in, her eyes wide, sensing that something powerful was happening, something that would change all of them forever. Asterisk, the storm outside had shifted from rage to endurance. It no longer roared, but pressed against the windows and heavy sheets, relentless, as if testing the restaurant's fragile walls. Inside, the kitchen glowed like a refuge, steam curling upward, every breath steeped in cinnamon, butter, and something deeper, memory. Catherine sat at the small still counter, the spoon trembling between her fingers. The soup Marco had set before her seemed harmless, almost ordinary, and yet, with one taste, she felt herself undone. The first sip was velvet against her tongue, warm in a way she could not name. Cinnamon brushed her senses, vanilla lingered faintly, but beneath it all was a sweetness that carried her back across decades. A laugh, a lullaby, the sound of rain against a window in another kitchen long ago. Her breath caught, her chest burned. She set the spoon down with a sharp clink, but the taste clung to her lips. Demanding she face what she had buried. "Are you all right?" Marco asked quietly. She shook her head, unable to answer. Her hands pressed against the cold counter as if anchoring her to the present. But the past was already spilling in. She saw her mother's face, not the faint blur preserved in photographs, but vivid, alive. Her mother humming as she stirred a pot, the very same scent filling their small home. Catherine remembered curling up on the counter as a child, swinging her legs, waiting for the moment her mother would hand her the first spoonful. That was before everything fractured, before her mother's illness, before Catherine, barely out of her teens, had thrown herself into ambition, into achievement. Because grief was too heavy and silence too sharp. She had traded warmth for armor, and never looked back until now. She pressed her hand to her mouth. But the tears broke through anyway, hot and unrelenting. They fell into the soup, rippling the surface. "I haven't tasted this in 20 years. She whispered. "Nonsense." Her voice faltered. Don Marco stood across from her, arms loose at his sides. He didn't press. He didn't need to. The silence in the kitchen was heavy enough at last. Catherine reached for the locket around her neck, her fingers trembling. The chain had always been a weight she ignored, tucked beneath silk blouses and tailored jackets. Tonight it seemed to burn against her skin. She flipped it open with a soft click. Inside was the photo of her mother, younger than Catherine was now, smiling with a tenderness Catherine no longer knew how to imitate. Isabella peeked from the doorway, her curls bouncing as she stepped inside. "Who's that?" she asked softly, pointing to the locket. Catherine swallowed hard. "My mother," she managed, her voice thin. "She looks kind," Isabella said simply, as if that truth were obvious, like someone who would like hugs and soup. The child's words sliced through Catherine's defenses sharper than any deal, any argument, any corporate war. She closed the locket quickly, her hand trembling. Marco's eyes narrowed slightly, as if a thought had begun forming, though he kept it to himself. "Food holds memories," he said instead. "It's why I cook, to remember, and to keep from losing what matters." Catherine gave a bitter laugh through her tears. "And what if remembering only reminds you of everything you failed to protect?" Marco leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Then you learn to forgive yourself before it poisons what's still in front of you." He nodded toward Emma, still sleeping peacefully nearby. Catherine turned her head, staring at her daughter. For the first time, she wondered if Emma had been starving not just for milk or puree, but for her, for warmth, for a presence Catherine had been too busy, too armored to offer. The realization struck like lightning, sharp and merciless. Her phone buzzed again on the counter. The screen lit up with her assistant's name. A string of urgent messages, shareholders demanding answers, meeting rescheduled to midnight, crisis unfolding. Catherine stared at it, then pressed the phone face down with shaking fingers. For once, she could not bring herself to answer. The storm outside groaned, thunder rumbling far away. The restaurant seemed to breathe with her silence. "You're not the only one who lost someone," Marco said softly. His eyes flicked to Isabella. who had climbed onto a stool and was doodling absent-mindedly on a napkin. When my wife passed, I thought I was drowning. I thought I couldn't raise her alone. But she saved me, piece by piece. Just like Emma will save you, if you let her. Catherine looked up sharply, her tears still wet on her cheeks. Something in Marco's tone, the unshaken certainty, the quiet weight, unsettled her. It felt too close, too much, as if he knew parts of her she hadn't revealed. And deep in her chest, something tightened, a question she couldn't name yet, but one that grew sharper as she looked at the locket, at the soup, at this man who spoke of grief as though their stories were not so far apart. For the first time in years, Catherine Blackwell felt a shadow of fear, not of markets or failure or empire, but of destiny itself, stirring in the scent of cinnamon and rain. Asterisk, the storm had softened to a steady rhythm, a drumbeat of water against glass. The rage was gone, but the relentlessness remained, as if the night itself refused to let them leave until truths were spoken. Bella Vista was quiet except for the simmer of broth on the stove, and the occasional sigh of the sleeping baby. Catherine sat at the counter, the silver locket burning like a brand against her skin. Her fingers kept drifting toward it, then pulling away, as though touching it too long might unravel her entirely. The taste of Marco's soup lingered in her mouth, pulling memories she had locked away for decades to the surface. She had wept, and she hated that she had wept. But some dam inside her had cracked and could no longer be resealed. "Try," Marco said, his voice quiet but steady. He slid the small porcelain dish back in front of her. The puree still steamed, fragrant with cinnamon and vanilla. "She'll take it from you now." Catherine's eyes darted to Emma, who had begun to stir in her carrier. The tiny hands twitched, the little body squirmed, and then a faint whimper rose. Fragile but insistent. Her stomach twisted. She had failed this moment before, too many times. Every attempt to feed her daughter ended in screams and frustration, until Catherine began handing the task to others. 2 nannies, the bottle she barely glanced at. And now, with Marco watching, with Isabella sitting cross-legged on the counter humming to herself, Catherine felt her pulse hammering in her throat. "I can't," she whispered. "You can," Marco replied. Her hand trembled as she picked up the spoon. Emma's whimper swelled into a cry, sharp and jagged. Catherine froze, panic rising. But then Marco stepped closer, his presence grounding, his hand hovering near hers without touching. "Steady," he murmured. "She doesn't need perfection. She just needs you." The words sank into her like a blade in a balm all at once. Catherine drew a breath, lifted the spoon again, and lowered it toward Emma's lips. The baby cried louder at first, her head turning. Catherine's heart cracked. "She's rejecting me again. She knows. She feels it. I'm not enough." But then Emma's mouth opened, tentative. The spoon touched her lips, a pause. A swallow. Silence. Asterisk. Emma blinked up at her mother, eyes wide and damp. Then she opened her mouth again. Catherine's vision blurred instantly. Her hand shook so violently she nearly dropped the spoon, but Emma reached with her tiny fists. Impatient, demanding more. Catherine fed her again and again, each swallow breaking something inside her. A chain she hadn't realized she had wrapped around her own heart. She laughed then, a sound broken and wet with tears, but real. "She's eating," she whispered, astonished. "She's really," Emma cooed softly, her cries replaced by contentment, and Catherine broke. The tears spilled faster now, unstoppable. She clutched Emma against her chest, the spoon clattering onto the counter, and pressed her face into her daughter's dark hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered fiercely, over and over. "I'm so sorry." The kitchen blurred in her vision. Isabella watched quietly, her crayons forgotten. Marco stood still, his arms folded, but his gaze was steady, almost too steady. It was then Catherine noticed it, the way he was watching, not just with empathy, but with something heavier, recognition. "You knew she would take it," Catherine said hoarsely, turning toward him. How could you be so certain?" Marco hesitated. The storm outside cracked with thunder, as though urging him to speak. His jaw tightened. "Because I've seen it before," he said finally. His eyes flicked to the locket still clutched in her hand. "Your mother. She used to make something almost exactly like this." The world tilted. Catherine's breath stopped. "What did you just say?" Marco didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned back to the stove. His silence weighted with something Catherine couldn't yet name. Suspense pressed thick in the air, the storm whispering against the glass. Her pulse loud in her ears, she looked down at Emma, who had drifted into soft, satisfied sleep against her chest. For years, Catherine had thought love meant sacrifice, ambition, building an empire her mother would have been proud of. But tonight, in this tiny restaurant filled with cinnamon and rain, she began to understand that love meant something else entirely, something she had almost lost forever, and yet beneath that fragile healing came a darker tremor. Marco's words lingered like a riddle. He knew her mother's recipe. How? Why? Catherine's heart pounded. She felt, for the first time in her life, that she was standing on the edge of something much larger than herself, something hidden, waiting, and about to change everything she thought she knew. The rain had finally eased, but the air outside Bella Vista hung heavy, as though the storm had only stepped aside to watch. The streetlights glowed in soft halos, their light blurring through the rain-slicked windows. Inside, the restaurant was still, caught in a fragile hush. Catherine sat with Emma cradled against her chest, the baby's tiny breaths warm against her collarbone. For the first time in months, maybe years, peace brushed her like a fragile wing. But beneath it, unease coiled. Marco's words still lingered. Your mother. She used to make something almost exactly like this. She turned toward him, her voice low but sharp. What do you know about my mother? Marco didn't answer right away. He busied himself at the stove, pouring broth into a pan that didn't need tending. His silence was deliberate, and it made Catherine's chest tighten. Tell me, she pressed, her tone carrying the same steel she used in boardrooms. But here, it trembled at the edges. Finally, Marco turned. His eyes were shadowed, not with evasion, but with the weight of someone who had carried a truth too long. Her name was Eleanor Blackwell. Catherine's breath caught. Yes, she whispered, her fingers tightening on the locket. But how? She came here, once, Marco said. Long before I bought this place. Before it was Bella Vista. It was smaller then. A different name. She was sick, but she still cooked. She left recipes with the owner. Recipes no one used. Until I found them in a box when I rebuilt this place. Catherine's heart pounded. She opened the locket with trembling hands, staring at her mother's photo. You're saying, I didn't know until tonight. Marco interrupted gently. When I saw your locket, when I tasted the soup again after years of cooking it for Isabella, your mother's handwriting was on the recipe card. Same ingredients, same notes in the margins, the cinnamon, the vanilla. She called it soup that tastes like hugs. The room tilted. Catherine gripped the counter to steady herself. Her mother's words, the exact words Isabella had spoken, the exact memory Catherine had buried. How could this be? She whispered. How could you have found it? Why here? Marco's voice was soft, almost reverent. Because she sold this building before she died. Quietly, to keep it alive, to keep it waiting. Catherine stared at him, the truth striking with the weight of destiny. Her mother had been here. Her recipes had survived here. This restaurant, this man, this night. None of it was coincidence. The storm outside groaned low. As if in agreement, Isabella slid from her stool and toddled over, clutching her latest drawing. Now for figures. A tall man, a curly-haired girl, a woman in blue crayon, and a baby with dark hair. She handed it solemnly to Catherine. Now it's a family dinner, she said. Catherine's chest cracked wide. She looked at the drawing, then at Marco, who stood silently, waiting, his eyes carrying both loss and hope. The air was thick with something larger than them both, grief, fate, the sense that her mother's hand had guided them here, through storms and years and pain. Her tears fell freely now, unhidden. She pressed Emma close, clutching the locket with her free hand. It feels like my mother led me here, she whispered, her voice breaking. Marco nodded once, solemn. Maybe she did. The Edison bulbs hummed softly. The soup simmered on the stove, and outside the rain finally ceased, leaving the world washed clean. Catherine Blackwell, billionaire, unbreakable titan, sat in a small neighborhood restaurant and wept, not from defeat, but from the shocking, impossible gift of being led back to her mother through a recipe. A stranger, and a storm. And for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid.